Hi, good evening. My name is Bashir Fancy. I'm the Chairman and CEO of Canadian Information Processing Society, CIPS. We're proud tonight to present Jason Dole of Tracker Networks on the very important subject of cybersecurity. So before I get to Jason, let me tell you a little bit about what CIPS is. Canadian Information Processing Society was formed in 1958 by Professor Kelvin Gottlieb, and CIPS is the only one with an IT designation that is recognized in our legislation. What CIPS does is there are three areas of designation specifically. One is AITP, or Associate Information Technology Profession, given to those who graduate from universities or colleges that are accredited by CIPS. When you go into the workforce and work in the technology field that you have graduated from and have practical hours to show and have already passed the ethics exam, you are given ISP, of course, after you apply and we review all the transcripts. ISP is Information Systems Professional, which is also recognized in many different countries. And the last part is ITCP, which is when you have demonstrated both the business and technology side, that not only do you understand and are proficient in IT, but you are able to lead, strategize, manage, is when you end up with ITCP. That is linked to Sophia Foundation, which is global. So it is a global designation. CIPS is not a lobby organization. We're all about standards, education, professionalism, code of ethics, and ensuring that those skills are very relevant and current. Now, very quick word on the ethics and integrity piece. Enough studies are coming out of Europe and elsewhere that show that the ethics and integrity is taking a hit in the technology field and the IT field, and therefore it is incumbent on us and the people involved to make sure that we fix that problem, to ensure that we upgrade it to the highest level possible, and that is not going to happen overnight. We need to work on that. That's a culture. Canadian Information Processing Society invites speakers from all over the world who are experts in their field to help enhance that knowledge, and once again keep it current. We also do special interest groups, mentoring, networking, body of knowledge. We are, as I said, not a lobby group. Canada dropped to 10th place globally in competitiveness. It didn't happen by fluke or by accident. Obviously, there were things we were not doing right. We need to correct that. We can play an important role in this to continue to enhance the skill sets, improve productivity, enhance professionalism, which is critical, of course, and the other part which is very critical is improving ethics and integrity. That will assist individuals to perform better, enable their organization to perform better, their communities, and by extension Canada. You can find all this information I've talked about and a lot more as we continue to do things every day by visiting www.kips.ca. If you have missed any of the webinars we have done in the recent past, we also record them and make them available, and some very interesting subjects that you would really love to hear about. So please take some time to go visit that site and look at the presentation. Now, what is the event today about? The webinar today is about cyber attacks that are growing in scope, impacting financial losses. As an executive vice president who was the global head for internal audit at Visa, but also led the risk management security, I'm only too familiar with the pain points involved here, and not too much has changed. Some parts have changed, so that's why this subject is very near and dear to my heart. They continue to grab headlines, leaving no sector immune. Nobody should be in that false sense of security that they're exempt from this. Criminals will seek out anybody where they can attack, where they can get large amounts of sensitive data or attack the critical infrastructure, because this is all about them making money. This, with evolving threats, the decision makers and boards must make sure that their organization have a strategy of information risk management to protect their assets. Ongoing budgetary pressures obviously prevent them from embracing and developing inside-out model that has both accountability and is sustainable. I don't believe anybody gets out of bed each day to do something bad, but circumstances are what we have to deal with. So our intent today here is to initiate a discussion between the business, technology, industry, cybersecurity experts, leaders who can collaborate more effectively. So it's not about talking, it's about doing. This webinar will focus on common challenges and practical ways of achieving this. One of the challenges that I should talk about, because I again saw it with AIS, DSS, and PCI as we rolled it out, is that we must ensure that we put the technology risk and demystify it and don't use those terms to the business and corner suite, but actually translate into what the business impact of that is, because that will help us tremendously if people realize that this is all about money. So if organizations are truly actually adhering to the fiduciary responsibilities at the board level, then they would be taking, and I'm sure some are taking this thing very seriously to achieve a much higher level of risk management and security. You don't have to take it from me, Gus. Look at the headlines every day. People are hacked. So those are not accidents. So without much further ado, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight, Jason Dole. He's co-founder of Tracker Networks, where he manages the company's go-to-market strategy, sales and marketing, and solution delivery. Jason works with leading organizations in Canada, US, Europe, advising them on technology and practical ways of actually achieving and sustaining it. Jason has an MBA from Schulich School of Business and an honors bachelor from Science from University of Western Ontario. So without holding you up and much further ado, let me hand it over to Jason Dole, who will walk you through tonight's presentation. Thank you and welcome, Jason.
So Bashir, thank you very much, and thank you everyone at CIPS for the opportunity to be here today. As Bashir has said, I'm Jason Dole from Tracker Networks. I'll first go over the agenda that I'm planning to work through today. I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit about my background and my perspective, or the perspective I bring to the risk management discussion. I'll talk about where we are today from a risk perspective, from a security perspective, and what we see that has changed recently. Talk about the shift for cybersecurity becoming part of risk management. I'll also talk about the roles of senior executives, what their responsibility is and what the responsibility of the board is. Talk about the opportunity for IT to take leadership, so making cybersecurity and risk management a priority and sort of shifting the conversation of the way that IT interacts with the organization. I'm going to talk for a little bit about some of the challenges that we see with some of the traditional approaches to IT risk management. And I'll also speak about a new model for IT risk management that we refer to as the inside-out model. I'll speak a little bit about Agile risk management, which is a part of that, and also talk a little bit about actioning risk information. And then I'll just finish off at the end with some other trends that people typically ask about when we're in the risk management discussion. So a little bit about me and my background. I'm, as Bashir has said, I'm Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of Tracker Networks. We're a software and services firm. We're in the risk management space. Probably the easiest way to describe what we do is we provide agile IT risk management solutions. We have clients in a number of different sectors. And we have clients in Canada, the US, and Europe. So that's given us the opportunity to have a fairly broad perspective of how different industries and different sizes of organizations are approaching cybersecurity and IT risk management. Before Tracker Networks, I was co-founder and a partner in a company called Assurant Secure Technologies. Assurant was unique in a few areas. In application security and vulnerability research, we provided some unique research services that powered I think it was 47 of the top 50 network security companies. And that business, we grew that business up and sold that to TELUS in 2006, and they still operate that. So I've been in the security space since the early 2000s, sort of starting in the application security area and vulnerability research area, and then moving into risk management more recently with Tracker. So that's kind of the perspective that I bring to the discussion. And based on that perspective, I would say that the world has definitely changed. We hear this a lot, but if I go back to my early days at Assurant, a lot of times the hacker that people were worried about, or who the actual hacker was, we call them the script kiddies, the kids with green hair. Typically, a hacker was somebody who was looking to make a name for themselves. They were looking for fame and glory, and if they hacked into an organization, they were usually pretty splashy about it. They told people what they had done to get credit. It really has changed from those days, and so hacking, has become less of a nuisance and an embarrassment, and much more of an enterprise risk issue. And I've put up some examples here. If you look at what's going on with Yahoo. And they've been in the news again now that we're realizing that they were in fact hacked twice. The deal to acquire Yahoo looks like it's still going to go through, but there's talk that they may lose $1 billion in market value off of that deal. So, pretty substantial enterprise, issue for Yahoo. Similarly for Ashley Madison, by the time that litigation is settled there, people are estimating that may cost them over $1 billion. The number that gets thrown around for Target is $350 million in direct costs, although not all of those lawsuits have been settled yet. And similar kind of number for Sony PlayStation, and after that, the Sony family got hacked again. So it really has gone from a nuisance to becoming an enterprise issue, and what's going along with that is the nature of the attacker has changed. It's not that kid with green hair anymore. If you look at who's involved, who's driving it, it's become big business. It's often organized crime, nation states, or people like anonymous hacktivists. And if you look at the research, you look at the numbers, there's a study from Mandiant, which is a FireEye company. The numbers would say that ultimately pretty much every organization gets hacked. They studied a few thousand organizations, and 97% of the companies that they studied had suffered a breach that went through all of their traditional security layers. And we're also in a world now where directors and senior officers of organizations do have real personal liability, and they're starting to become aware of that. So if I look back, as I say, over the last 10, 15 years, there really has been a significant shift in the cybersecurity landscape. And as I say, we now live in a world where you have to basically assume that you will be hacked, and you have to change your thinking in terms of how your organization gets prepared for that. So I'll spend a moment and just talk about a model that I think explains pretty well what's happening. And so I've put up a picture that many of you folks have probably seen before, and this is sort of a traditional model that gets used for explaining technology risk or information risk. And you have threats that face our business, or threats, I guess, that potentially affect our assets of our company, and we have vulnerabilities in those assets. And when those three things line up in just the wrong way, then that's what creates risk. And they have to line up in a particular way for risk to actually occur. From a business perspective, we have typically tried to assess the likelihood that something bad would happen to our assets this way, and we've also tried to assess the impact. And when you put those two things together, then you can try to calculate some kind of a business impact in terms of dollars or market share or reputation, goodwill. And then the whole idea behind risk management was that we're supposed to be identifying these risks proactively and then taking proactive steps to try to manage them. And so, I think this picture, sort of building on this picture, to me really sums up in one image what's been happening over the last 10 to 15 years. And essentially what's happened is all three of the circles have gotten bigger, and they're overlapping each other more. And as a result, the red area in the middle that we call the risk has gotten quite a bit larger. We just finished talking about the fact that the threats have increased. The nature of the attacker is quite a bit different than it was 10 years ago. Similarly, the assets that we're exposing to cyber risk have increased as well. 10, 15 years ago, we weren't really putting our core systems on the internet, or we weren't necessarily connecting as many of our core systems to our business partners. If you look now at most companies, anybody who relies in any way on technology, they have the heart of their business exposed on the internet. They're making connections between their core, most critical systems with their business, with their supply chain, with their business partners and customers. So it really is the core of the business that is exposed today. And as the asset circle's gotten bigger, then that's kind of dragged the vulnerability circle along with it. When you have vulnerabilities, in assets that aren't exposed to the outside world, they're not as big of a deal. But when those assets are exposed to the world now, suddenly the vulnerabilities in them are suddenly very important. And so that's really, if we kind of sum it up, and I guess this is just kind of showing where this is coming from. As we talked about, we're giving customers access, we're giving our channel partners access, and the Internet of Things, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's another tidal wave that's coming in terms of the way that we're opening, our assets and opening our companies to the world. And so again, if I were to sum that up, I would say that new and bigger threats, are overlapping more with more valuable assets in our business. And this is all being exposed by all these new ways of doing business and all this innovation in our companies. I'll talk for a moment about the shift in thinking of viewing cybersecurity as part of risk management. If you kind of look back historically at how people viewed security, it was really seen, first and foremost as a technical problem. It was IT's problem, and it was seen in a pass-fail, binary kind of view. You were either secure or you weren't. But that's not really how it works. I mean, we've already seen, and we just talked about the fact that there is no such thing as perfect security. 97% of organizations get hacked. So if we're viewing it as this pass-fail view, then we're setting ourselves up to fail. We're always going to fail. The other perspective on this, and the reason that this sort of view doesn't hold true, is that if you look at what it takes to practice good security, it goes far beyond the scope of what a CIO or an IT organization would normally control. You're very much dependent on your people. You're dependent on what they do. You're dependent on your business processes and decisions that business people make outside of the technology area. You're dependent on many of your third-party relationships and how those third-party relationships get managed. And so these are all things that fall, as I say, beyond the scope of the IT team. And so to view this cybersecurity entirely as an IT problem doesn't make sense. There's inherently, when you're looking at security, ultimately there are inherently business judgments and trade-offs that have to be made. And this sort of circle is kind of a classic risk management circle of, identifying what are the risks that we really face, what do we think we can accept as an organization, and what are we prepared to do about it? How much are we prepared to invest? How much are we prepared to change our business practices or avoid certain practices? And so this cycle is really what it takes to properly manage cybersecurity and properly manage risk. And that, again, is inherent. It inherently has these business judgments in it. So really, when you step back and think about it, it's pretty clear that security is not really a technical problem. It is at its core a risk problem, and it is at its core a business problem. And so that's, the first sort of conclusion out of this is it inherently is a business risk issue. And the growing potential impact is what makes it an enterprise risk issue. The fact that the impacts have become so significant means it's not just a small issue anymore. It's something that's an enterprise risk and something that, right up to the board needs to be concerned with. I would say that, often when I do meet with business executives or I get to speak with board members, I'll point out to them that they're actually part of the problem if they're viewing it as technical. There's a bit of a disconnect that you often see where a senior executive on the business side or a board member will be very quick to talk about how concerned they are about cybersecurity. But then they also want to dust their hands of it really quickly and say, okay, but I rely on my IT people to worry about that. And so when I get to speak with those folks, I often am pointing out to them that they're actually part of the problem if they're seeing it that way. And by the same token, I often, when I speak with CIOs, point out that they're part of the problem if they're not taking steps to engage with the business and engage with the executive team. And I kind of like this image of the guy with the rock on his back, because this is what a lot of IT teams and a lot of CIOs are doing, is by not going out proactively and trying to educate the business and engaging them, they're putting it all on their shoulders. And they might be doing all the right things, but if they stumble, the rock's going to crush them, and nobody else. And that's a lot of what's going on right now. So that's a sort of a segue into, what really is the role of directors and officers. There's a key concept that most directors on a board of directors are bound by, and it's this concept of duty of care. And it's really the idea that they have to be taking prudent steps to protect the organization. They have to be making reasonable decisions. They have to make sure that they're reasonably informed and taking reasonable steps. And this here is something that's come out of the Supreme Court of Canada, and they're basically saying it was some litigation and a decision that they made, and they're saying that directors and officers will not be held in breach of the duty of care if they act prudently and on a reasonably informed basis. And so really what this is all saying, people through litigation, through lawsuits, have been trying to make the case that, board members maybe didn't meet their duty of care when there's a cybersecurity breach. The courts are basically saying that, that it's possible, but not an easy case to make. So it's a pretty low bar that directors and officers have to meet, but they do have to do something. They do have to be proactive. They do have to provide effective oversight from a security perspective or from a risk perspective. The other sort of big trend that we're seeing right now is folks like the Institute of Corporate Directors are proactively going out and educating board members, and especially people who sit on audit committees. And I've had the opportunity to see some of the materials that get provided by ICD, and this is something again that is a real change over the last 10 years. If you look back 10 years ago, board members really weren't asking much about cybersecurity. They were concerned about risk issues, but more general business risk issues. And if they were getting into anything to do with cyber, it was really more around business continuity or disaster recovery, and it was kind of a checkbox exercise. Now you see, board members are being educated on what questions to ask and where to stick their nose in, so to speak. And I hear lots of stories from customers whose board members have asked very specific questions of them, asking things like, where's our crown jewel data, and asking about some specific practices. So, there have been a number of lawsuits. Directors, are aware of the fact that they have some liability. They're aware of the fact that people have been trying to sue directors under duty of care provisions, and they're getting education, from various groups, the various groups that they take direction from. The other shift that we see is the evolving role of the CFO, and the CFO has often been viewed as responsible for risk. In the early days, that would be from a financial perspective, but you're seeing that definition really broaden, and a lot of CFOs are taking on or are being given responsibility for cyber risk management, and they're being seen as the protector of all assets of the business, including information assets. And this is a quote here, or this is rather a snippet from the bio of the CFO for the Harvard Medical School. And this is in the first line of his bio. It says he's responsible for maintenance of records and procedures required to adequately safeguard the assets of the organization. And I just picked on that one because it was one that I saw recently, and you're seeing that more and more often. It's right in the first line of their job description. So the CFO is someone that, from an IT perspective, that we can often elicit the support and help from to make cybersecurity and risk management a priority in the organization. Similarly, we're seeing chief operating officers or line of business executives getting much more involved. Their clients are concerned and are asking questions. They're often having to respond to client requests for information around how their data and assets will be safeguarded. And COOs, they read the news and they're concerned, and they want to make sure that their business unit isn't one that's going to have a serious business interruption. So we're seeing COOs get more involved as well. From a liability perspective, explore that a little bit more. There have been a number of court cases that are essentially testing this idea of duty of care, and they started with shareholder derivative lawsuits. So essentially, shareholders getting together and trying to sue directors and officers, saying that we were hacked, we lost a lot of share value, and you weren't meeting your duty of care to protect the organization and protect my share value. Here's something from one of the Delaware courts, and they were basically saying that the only way in which they would have, the case was dismissed, but they said that for them to have found the directors liable, they would have had to utterly fail to implement systems, and they would have had to consciously fail to monitor. And so, again, what the courts are saying is it's a pretty low bar. But if you talk to lawyers, what they're taking from this is that basically the courts are saying over and over again that you have to, as a board member, you have to have a system of oversight in place as it relates to risk management and cybersecurity, and you have to continuously monitor that, and you have to make yourself aware of that. So up until now, the lawsuits haven't been successful, but they're continuing, and so they've now morphed, and you're also seeing class action lawsuits. So Target is subject to both shareholder derivative lawsuits and class action lawsuits. What you're seeing here is you're seeing now customers and financial institutions, other third parties that are claiming that they were harmed, are trying to sue directors and officers. And so, again, they haven't been successful so far, but there's lots of legislation or litigation coming, and it's certainly got the attention of many board members. So much so, I've put a picture up here of my friend Imran Ahmad, who Imran is a lawyer and partner with Miller Thompson, and he runs their national cyber law practice. So Miller Thompson is one of the biggest law firms in Canada, and they have a fairly large practice dedicated to cyber law. And Imran is, to me, it's just kind of evidence of how concerned officers and board members are that Imran is kept pretty busy meeting with directors, meeting with CEOs, helping them to understand what their legal risks are. He's also unfortunately kept pretty busy after people have been hacked, because he often gets called in afterwards to help people clean up. So that's a real shift. I mean, 5 years ago or so, you would not have seen the law firms organized around this. And again, to me, that's just a sign that people at the top of the organization are really concerned about this and want to know what their legal risks are. There's another big trend that relates to this and has the attention of board members, and that's the General Data Protection Legislation, or GDPR, that is being enacted in Europe. So we're in a phase-in period right now. It comes in officially in 2018. There's a number of things that come from GDPR, or I guess GDPR is what the acronym is. Number of things coming. One of them is that companies will have to appoint a data protection officer, and that data protection officer is going to report directly to the regulator. And there's some pretty stiff penalties. I think it's up to 4% of annual turnover if a company's found in breach. So up to 4% of gross sales or gross revenue. And there's a number of other sort of requirements that come out of that. There are some benefits, certainly for consumers and also for organizations trying to operate in the EU. It's going to drive standardization across the EU. It's going to be one set of regulations, whereas in North America, our regulations tend to be much more driven by sectors. So it will standardize things, but it's got some real teeth. And it's absolutely has the attention of directors and senior officers, and if you're a company in North America that does business in Europe, then it's going to apply to you as well, and so your directors and officers are probably already aware of it or starting to ask some questions. Yeah, so they're probably already aware of it or starting to ask some questions. I think there's something I, again, often talk a lot about with IT teams and with CIOs, is that we see a tremendous opportunity for IT to take leadership on this. If you in most organizations, there is concern at the top. So senior executives, board members are concerned. They're hearing news stories. They're asking questions like, "Are we going to be next?" They know that they're accountable to do something, but they don't necessarily know exactly what to do. And so there's a real sort of vacuum, and there's a real pull and a real desire for information. I speak with a lot of CIOs who go and brief the board for the first time to do some awareness training or to sort of educate them on cyber risk issues, and they suddenly become a standing item on the board agenda every quarter. Now, they often sort of say that, as in a, what did I get myself into kind of thing. But the reality is by taking that kind of step, you really have an opportunity to shape the agenda from the top. And so, as I say, that just a tremendous opportunity to be proactive and to set the conversation. There, board members realize they have to do something. They don't know exactly what necessarily, and so you've got a real chance to basically determine what that is. And in the process of having that dialogue, you're effectively co-opting them or bringing them into the dialogue around risk management and cybersecurity, and gives you an opportunity to shape and have input on the priorities of the company, and really sort of change the way that the organization views IT. So shifting away from this pass-fail view, starting to educate people that security really is a business issue, and in the process of doing that, redefining IT as an organization that is more of a consultant on these issues, as opposed to just somebody you call when something's broken. The other sort of piece of this is by engaging with the senior executive and the board, by starting to make this shift into a risk management culture away from this old sort of technical view of security. What you end up doing actually is putting in place you start to build a culture or put in place practices that help the organization to make risk decisions. And you see organizations that go down this road actually are able to embrace innovation faster, because they have a framework, they have a way for the business to understand and to make decisions and accept risk around certain IT initiatives. And so people often, are afraid of cybersecurity. They're afraid of risk management, thinking that it's going to be a way to say no to things, say no to new ventures. When it's actually the opposite. When there's a mature risk management culture and set of practices, it's, companies actually that have that actually out innovate their peers. While their peers are kind of frozen and not sure how to move forward, they're the ones that are actually trying new things first, finding ways to reasonably contain and manage risk, and actually out innovating their peers and their competitors. If you are in the position where you're going to be briefing the board on risk management and on cybersecurity, my number one piece of advice, I guess, is to keep it simple. And I put this binder here with the number 500 as a reminder for myself. Our chairman at Tracker has been on many boards. He currently sits on the board, the Greater Toronto Airport Authority board. And he recently was preparing for a board meeting, and he'd spent most of his day reading, and he had told me that he'd had a binder sent to him that was 500 pages, and he had to go through and try to familiarize himself with that. And so, you have to remember that people coming into these board meetings have just been absolutely inundated with information, and they'll find it very refreshing when you can keep it incredibly simple and just use a few pictures, keep your slides very, very light. I'll go back. The other piece of it, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few slides, is to give them context. You can't go in and talk technical because you're going to lose them right away. So you've got to find ways to speak in a currency or speak in a language that they're going to relate to. And we'll come back and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And again, I bring back my image of the CIO with the rock, that, as much as there's an opportunity to engage, there's also a risk in not engaging. And the reality is we can be doing all the right things in IT. We can have an excellent risk framework in place, and we can and have really good controls in place. But at the end of the day, it's not really about if we're not engaging with the business and the board, then we have the rock on our back. And it's not really about what we're doing, but it's about what the rest of the organization understands that we're doing and what they've bought into. And it's really important to bring them into the dialogue so that they're effectively kind of co-opted. They're part of the decision. And so it's not entirely on our shoulders. And again, as you say, if it's entirely on our shoulders and something goes wrong, well, we know where the target is. So I'll talk for a moment now about some of the challenges with traditional risk management approaches. And a lot of, if you look at IT risk management and how it's practiced today, there's a lot of stuff I don't necessarily agree with. I mean, a lot of it comes out of compliance, and a lot of it comes out of the financial world. And that's a world where people deal routinely with numbers. And so you've got, numbers and the idea of probability, is much easier to assign. And so this sort of traditional risk method of, assessing what the impact of something happening is, what the probability of something happening would be, and then timesing that by what the impact would be, that's a little bit easier to do in the financial services world. It's often very difficult to do in the technology world. Human beings don't do a great job of assessing probability when it comes to rare events. So if you actually look at some of the psychological research, if you take someone who's a non-expert and you ask them about a low probability event like being hacked, if they're a non-expert, then they tend to attribute that probability or they tend to estimate that probability as being zero. So they basically will underestimate the probability and they'll say it's not going to happen to me. At the same time, if you ask that same question of someone who's an expert, they tend to go the other way. They tend to overestimate the probability that they're going to be, something like being hacked will happen. So you have this automatic disconnect where the experts are overestimating and the non-experts are underestimating. And so no wonder these two can't talk to each other. The business isn't buying in on the probability. And And what ends up happening as well is because these things are so hard to assess, there's a lot of thumb in the air kind of estimating activity that goes on. And by the time the risk assessments get brought up to senior executives, they're not necessarily believed. And I put in quotes here the words subjective and the word self-serving. And I've heard these as direct quotes from senior executives. There's a CFO who said both of these things to me, that they'd gotten a risk assessment, and it was basically, the risk was that they didn't have something called a SIM, which is like a security monitoring center or security monitoring technology. So the risk was they didn't have a SIM and they were going to be hacked, and therefore they needed to buy a SIM and they needed to spend $500,000. And so, or they're not going to be secure. And so to a CFO, that seemed, pretty self-serving. So I think there's been some challenges with applying traditional risk approaches to technology, and just like in the example that I just gave of the CFO and the SIM solution, it doesn't present information in a way or with the kind of context that business people can understand and make decisions on. Risk assessment also, or IT risk assessment, has often been done at a couple of extremes. It's either been done manually with spreadsheets, so every year maybe we go and we answer a checklist, or we do a survey once a year, or maybe we don't do it every year, maybe we only do it when requested. So it's been manual and inconsistent. Or it's sometimes the other extreme, where and this is if you go and look at some of the very large organizations, like some of the large banks, there are some very expensive and complicated risk management solutions, very, very capable, very functional, but those organizations have teams. One of the large banks has over 200 people on I won't say the name of the vendor, but it's a large software package they use. They have over 200 people on that team. And so you often see IT risk management as one extreme or the other. And so there's a lot of organizations in the middle, basically everybody below the biggest banks and insurance companies, that have been kind of shut out of the IT risk management game because they don't have the resources or the money, the people to embark on the complicated approach, but they're also too big to go through the manual spreadsheet approach. The other comment I'd make is that I think there's been way too much focus on the threat side of things. There's been this sort of mindset and model, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but there's been this mindset of, we've got to put walls around the organization and protect us from everything outside. And we really haven't put a lot of thought into what are our most critical assets? What do we consider to be our most important data? Where is it? And who's connecting to the organization? How are we taking these systems with our critical data? How are we connecting those to our partners and suppliers? And again, everybody tends to focus on sort of the outside view. And I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. But that's a big issue, I think, in IT risk management today. And the last point I'll make is, if you look at issues in risk management today, there's a real bias towards just buying the latest and greatest security technology and slapping it on. And this is part of this kind of outside walls view that I'll talk about in a moment. So I'll sort of transition out of that into what are some of the more modern approaches that people are taking in IT risk management right now. And how do you overcome some of these challenges? How much investment, how much effort is enough? First thing I'll talk about is a shift that we see from what we call the outside-in model to the inside-out model. And as I was just starting to allude to, the traditional view or mindset, I guess, was that we have our assets inside of our organization, our systems and our data, and we put these virtual walls around our company. And the job was to put the firewalls up and to have these various layers and to keep everything outside. And it almost didn't matter what was inside the walls. We didn't really have to worry about that. We didn't have to worry about what our assets were, where our data was, because we had the walls. Well, first of all, the walls, I don't think that model ever worked. There never really was a perimeter. But the idea of that, the idea that we have a perimeter is completely gone today. I mean, we are taking, all of our core systems, we're connecting them to each other over the internet, we're connecting them to our partners, to our customers, we're giving access through new channels, we're letting people now come in through mobile devices, we've got the Internet of Things coming. So this idea that we can have a wall around things, it never really worked, and people pretty much accept that it really doesn't work today. And so as a result of that, is really shifting to is a different model, and we call this more the inside-out model. And this is that organizations, yes, you still have to have firewalls, and you do have to do your network security and your, but those sorts of things are really table stakes activities. And so what organizations now are doing, though, is saying, do we understand what our most critical assets are? Do we know what we consider to be our crown jewels? What's our most important data? What are the systems that store that data, and how are they connected to each other? How are they connected to the outside world? And as I say, as part of that, what's really critical is understanding dependencies, understanding connections. And something that I use to illustrate this, I'm not sure how many folks here have heard of Fazio Mechanical Services before or not. I hadn't a few years ago. I know who they are now. They're an HVAC vendor, I think in Western Pennsylvania or in Ohio. They're better known as the company that that caused Target to get hacked. So for folks who don't know the story, it wasn't Target that was actually initially hacked. It was Fazio, who was an HVAC vendor supplying or servicing Target in their stores. And I guess somewhere along the way, someone had realized or decided it would be a really good idea to connect Fazio's systems to Target systems. They had a project management, scheduling billing system, and no doubt one of the business units saw some efficiency in making connections, to make things flow more easily. And so what ended up happening, as it usually does, is it was Fazio that got compromised. The intruders then used those credentials, used that connection to get into Target systems, escalated, and after a couple of more hops, they found themselves on a server that had point-of-sale data. And then ultimately, they were able to send that data back out to a staging server that they controlled. And so, again, if we sort of take this back to where we started, we live now in a world where eventually everybody gets hacked. There is no such thing as perfect security. The idea that you can put a wall around things and have a secure perimeter has been debunked. And so really the most practical way to get at this is to turn it around 180 degrees and instead start off by understanding what are our crown jewels. And we're not going to stop everything. We're not going to stop ourselves from getting hacked. It's kind of like my house. You might break into my house, and maybe I'm okay if you steal the silverware and my flat screen TV, because those aren't such a big deal. But maybe, my grandma's engagement ring that's an heirloom that I've got hidden in the basement, I want to make sure you don't get that. Okay. So we'll talk for a minute. This term crown jewels gets thrown around a lot, so we'll talk for a minute about what are crown jewels. Probably the easiest way to describe it is to say, crown jewels are what you would consider to be your most critical data and systems. And, another way to look at it would be to say, what would be most damaging to your organization if it were to get hacked or compromised, or what can you not operate without, and it really varies for different organizations. So for some organizations, it might be intellectual property. It could be their software code. It could be a secret recipe. For other organizations, it might be customer data. And some organizations may not be that concerned about customer data, but other organizations may feel like if their customer information gets out, their reputation will be ruined and they'll be put out of business. And we're seeing that with Ashley Madison now. We work with a number of healthcare providers, a number of hospitals. They certainly see private health information, PHI, is their crown jewel data. If a hospital gets hacked, it's not going to go out of business. It's still a hospital tomorrow. But the regulatory, concerns, as well as the political concerns, political ramifications around it, make it such that all of the senior executives in a hospital are aware of PHI and are concerned about that. So, it's different for all organizations, but a real quick way, to help, we say to CIOs or to business executives is to really think about what's the stuff you can't live without and would be most damaging. The concept of crown jewels is often we find it's a useful shorthand when you're communicating with business executives and with the board. They can intuitively get that concept. The term is being used in the media quite a bit, and we've actually had some cases where board members are starting to now ask about crown jewels. We've had CIOs say, hey, my board member asked me about those at the last meeting. This concept of crown jewels is entirely consistent with a more detailed data classification, so it's not in place of that. It's usually something that's an overlay on top of it. And as I mentioned, it's something that's often in the media these days. I'm going to talk for a minute about something else that's often in the media now, or you hear more about, and this is the idea of agile IT risk management. And this is the space that my organization, Tracker, sees ourselves in. So it's something that we live and breathe each day. The idea around agile IT risk management is just goes back to the idea that, for many organizations, they're either not doing IT risk management, or they're doing it on spreadsheets and they're doing it inconsistently, or there's very complex systems that are expensive and difficult to set up and maintain. And so there's this new field of risk management that is really focused around trying to keeping it smaller, trying to drive results more quickly, and really taking iterative steps. So getting a quick win, getting something that executives can understand and visualize, getting buy-in, and then expanding. And keeping it easy as part of that. So these are some of the key concepts. A concept that goes along with that is the idea, we use the term of minimum viable information. You sometimes hear this in agile software development about minimum viable functionality. We find often in risk management, especially when people are starting for the first time, there's a tendency to want to collect a lot of information, to collect all kinds of attributes about the critical applications and data without a real clear idea of what you're going to do with that information afterwards. That might be nice from a big data perspective if you want to analyze later, but what ends up happening is almost all the time people try to collect too much information and they really don't get anywhere with the business. The business, it just seems overwhelming and they don't make any progress. So what we say instead is, collect a very small amount of information, drive a quick win, get buy-in, and then start to add additional information you're collecting very selectively and with a purpose. The other thing that we find is a really practical way to get results quickly is to focus on the crown jewels. So again, instead of sort of doing the traditional approach of impact and probability, executives can understand data. They can understand, critical applications. If you go to a business executive in a hospital and you talk about personal health information, and you talk about the clinical imaging system, and you talk about how the clinic, which parts of the hospital are dependent on the clinical imaging system, that's something that business executives can understand, and it's very tangible to them. As I mentioned before, focusing on quick wins, celebrating successes. And the other thing is, when you're starting out on an IT risk management, is to be realistic about your culture. And this kind of goes back to the comment I was making about minimum viable information. If your organization is new to IT risk management, don't expect that people are going to go, from 0 to 100 very quickly. So you keep it very, very simple. Start perhaps with one area of the organization. Model the technology or data risk in one particular part of the company. Maybe get one line of business executive bought in, and then once you have that working model, then you can start to expand that and make it deeper through the organization. And the other piece that goes along with that is we say time and time again, is as much as you can, is use pictures, keep it visual. I'm being a little self-serving. I'm showing some pictures from Tracker here, but that's not so much the point. The point is that being able to go and sit with a line of business executive and having something that's more like a visual map or a picture, and saying to them, look at, here's what your organization looks like to us from an IT organization. These circles are your applications. Here's where your crown jewel data is. The red ones are where most of the risk are. That's the kind of picture, and that's the kind of level that a business executive can probably understand. And you're starting to now bring them. You're starting to demystify technology, and you're starting to bring them into the dialogue around where risk comes from, and they're starting to understand now better how some of the things they're doing from a business practice perspective are impacting the risk that you're trying to help them manage. The important thing, or a thing we often talk about with CIOs is, now that you've started IT risk management, how do you manage the risk data that you're generating? And so I'm going to just pause for a minute here. I'm not sure how many of you have seen this commercial, but I think it does a great job of summing up the problem. So we'll just run that. So we'll play this little ad here from LifeLock. It's an identity management or identity security company.
Yep, it's termites.
Oh, get rid of them.
Oh, no, I'm not an exterminator. I'm a pest monitor. I only let you know when there's a problem. There's a problem. Bye.
I think a number of us can relate to that commercial when we're dealing with the business units a lot of times, and we're finding risk information. So what you'll find when you do start to do IT risk assessment, you start to gather risk data. You'll find a few things. You will certainly find things that can be closed quickly, and so it will be important, as you set up a program, to have a feedback loop, to have, a process to make sure that things are getting remediated. Again, many of those you'll be able to remediate pretty quickly, but there are going to be other things that you're going to find that are not so easy to fix. They're going to be architectural in nature. It may be that risk is coming from a legacy system that has limitations on the way that it can function, and so you're going to have to make longer term plans. Maybe put some remediations in place, but you're going to have to make longer term plans, possibly even to replace those systems. And so what we see a lot of CIOs doing with their risk management program is they're using the risk information they get as an input into their IT roadmap, into their IT plans. They're aligning those things. And so now risk becomes just one more set of data that gets used to support the IT plan, along with strategic capabilities and cost management. The other sort of key piece of it, and I mentioned this earlier with the pictures, is a key part of actioning risk information is to bring the business units into the dialogue. We often suggest that people do risk assessment by lines of business or by specific business areas, business service areas, and getting the business, finding a business executive who is engaged and interested and maybe forward thinking in this area, involve them in the results. You'll find that's an iterative process, and then that individual will become your champion to go into other areas of the business afterwards. The other thing that's key about risk management is we use the term operationalizing it, but it really shouldn't be something that is just done on a one-time basis. It needs to be something that's baked into your ongoing processes. So when there's a new project, when there's a significant change, these things get fed back into the risk assessment process. And then you also, take some of the artifacts, like some of the dashboards, some of the maps and pictures that come out of it, and bake those into your regular operational reviews. So if you've got, the IT team or the CIO's key managers are sitting down on a monthly basis, then those dashboards become part of it. Or maybe there's an email summary that executives get on a weekly or a monthly basis. And by getting that into the way that business is done, then that's going to drive the program and help keep it current. And I guess I've actually covered off some of these bullets already. So talk for a minute about how to get buy-in, because a lot of times what IT organizations find is they want to involve other parts of the business, but the business is kind of saying, "Hey, you guys take care of it. You're IT." And so it's a lot of times in IT, we're having to work to get the business engaged and get them on board. So the very first foundational thing is you've got to be proactive. You've got to initiate the risk discussion. You can't sort of give up before you start. You've got to reach out and engage the business, engage the executive, suggest to the CEO that you can help support their agenda with the board, by educating the board on risk management, and get yourself into your first board meeting if you haven't gone yet. The other thing and I mentioned this just a moment ago, is we find what's very helpful is to align a risk assessments by business units. So, start with a business unit executive who's more forward thinking, who's maybe more concerned about these things. Generate your maps or your pictures or your risk assessments for that business unit. And then you can, when you've got a model that's working and you've got some results, you've now got a template that you can show other business units. It's easier for them to understand what you're doing. And as you get multiple business units on board, you've now got a little bit of competitiveness that's going on, in that if a business unit is not is sort of dragging their feet on risk management, you've got other business units that are making positive strides on it. You can use a little bit of peer pressure to help get them on board as well. The other thing that we talk about a lot is finding the right currency, and what we mean by that is finding the right language and the right terms to get the business interested. And not that long ago, actually, Bashir and I were at an event together, and there was an individual there from higher education sector, and he was using an example of how he was going out and he was speaking with the the sort of educational side of the business, so the faculties, and he was talking to them about personally identifiable information and the need to protect it and some of the legislation, and he said the eyes were just rolling back and glazing over, and he said so he turned that around a little bit and he started using the term intellectual property. And he said the researchers kind of sat up right away saying, you mean my research, my life's work could be stolen. And he started turning that into maybe their ability to get future research funding, depending on what happens from a security perspective. And so what he found was that by changing some simple terms and finding the thing that they cared about, he was able to get a very different result and a very different level of interest and buy-in. The other example that I can share comes from one of our law firm clients, and there the director of IT had been talking to the partners about hacking risk, and he'd been talking about regulatory concerns, and same kind of thing. Really, no interest from senior partners. What ended up happening though, was that one of the firm's largest clients, suddenly became concerned and forced the firm to go through, sort of a validation exercise. And so what the director of IT was able to do was to kind of turn hacking and cybersecurity into a customer marketing tool or it's a matter of customer confidence. And so again, he really changed the language and he tied it into making it a competitive differentiator for the partners when they were out, bidding on new business. And so again, he had to stop sort of talking like a compliance person and start talking more like a business person in the currency that the business people cared about. And every organization is going to be different, so you have to find in your organization what that is. As I've been saying through this, the key in all of this is to get business executives to the table. So that there's mutual decisions being made. You're not going to get funding to do everything. And so what a risk assessment or what risk management will help you to do is to sort of baseline across the company, identify where the greatest risks are. You can come forward with your plan and your recommendations for the sort of longer term remediation activities, and then make it a joint decision with the business, and so at least that way you've done everything that you can as a CIO or everything you can as an IT team to be consultative and present the risks as you see them, and it's up to the business to ultimately decide where the priorities are. Another thing that can be kind of a helpful way to raise the issue or get it more profile in the organization is to help facilitate a briefing for the board, and that can be, as I mentioned, it can be the CIO or someone from the technology or risk group going and speaking to the board. But often what happens sometimes is people will bring someone like my friend Imran from Miller Thompson in to come and brief the board from a legal perspective. So maybe work with your chief counsel in your organization, bring in a law firm, someone like Miller, have them come and brief the board about what what the current state of litigation is, what are some of the steps that the board and the company can take to reduce legal risk around cybersecurity. That process can kind of almost be kind of a backdoor way to get board members realizing how serious the issue is and getting the company more focused on it. This is not so much something to do, but I would say a result of this whole process is when you go through this kind of process and when you do make it, bring business into the conversation, what you find happens is that the view of cybersecurity and the view of risk management really shifts. People start off thinking it's a block, and you really can reposition it as an enabler. And again, if you go back to the financial services industry, when they started in business risk management or enterprise risk management, what the outcome of that is that financial firms that do a better job of risk management take on riskier portfolios because they know how to manage the risk, and they end up driving revenue. So if you look in financial services, risk management is absolutely seen as a revenue driver. And I think that same opportunity applies in IT if we shift our thinking a little bit and we look at, how can we out-innovate? How can we be an organization that's faster to introduce innovation because we know how to get our executive on board, we know how to say yes to the right things, no to the right things, and make innovation come to market faster. So we'll talk for a minute about some of the benefits. From a board member's perspective, they're hearing over and over again. They read the news stories. They're hearing from the Institute of Corporate Directors and other places that they need to do something. And so by helping them to put in place an ongoing sort of control framework that keeps them up to date, you're going to give them personal liability. They're going to feel that they're doing the right thing for the company, which they want to do. By making it agile, you can keep it simple, but still effective. And, for board members, they may not say it, but they're concerned about their personal liability, and you can help them to alleviate that. Similarly, from a CEO or from a CFO's perspective, they also certainly want to have peace of mind and lower their personal liability. CEOs, CFOs are often thinking about the catastrophic situation, the catastrophic loss. And so helping them to feel that, you've got a good handle on the risks and you've got a program in place that's going to make that less likely is going to help them. And the other, as I say, the other way that a CEO and a CFO are going to benefit from this is by helping the organization to unlock innovation, helping the organization to grow faster by having a risk management framework that helps you introduce innovation faster. From a line of business head perspective, it's similar in that they want to unlock innovation and grow faster. They also want to know that they're doing everything they can to protect their customers and protect their business. And the other thing that line of business executives often respond to is the idea that if and when something does happen, that they'll be able to recover the business faster. And that's one of the big benefits that comes out of the kind of exercise we're talking about, is that you have a better understanding of where the crown jewels are. You have a better understanding of what's connected to what and which systems are supporting which parts of the business. And you've got a much better ability to recover faster when something does happen. From a CIO's perspective, there's a whole bunch of benefits to taking a proactive view of IT risk management. You've got an opportunity to engage with the business and the executive. And the term we often hear a lot from the CIOs we work with is they want to get out of that knee-jerk reaction to what's blowing up or what's happening today, and they want to get more proactive. And as part of that, what ends up happening is the view of IT often shifts. So instead of seeing IT as that organization you call when something's wrong, a lot of times the business units will start to see IT as more of a consultant who's helping them to understand better and is now speaking their language better. And that's really a transition that a lot of CIOs and directors of IT want to make for their organizations. Implementing the kinds of program we're talking about is going to definitely lower risk for the organization, and it's going to put you in a position to recover faster. The other sort of benefit, pleasant unintended benefit, is when you go through this kind of exercise and when you identify where the crown jewel data is in particular, we've often seen the case where IT now develops some expertise in understanding where the data is in the organization. A lot of times people don't know what data they have. There's a lot of duplication and overlap. And so IT, again, instead of being the people that just fix things, being seen as this consultative organization that helps the business make decisions and helps the business understand what data they have. And the other sort of big benefit that comes out of this is we see a lot of smart CIOs using this kind of input to help with the long-term IT plan. They weave it into their IT roadmap. So instead of sort of hiding from problems, they're turning over the rocks, identifying them, and then weaving that into the plan to do something about it. So I'll speak for a few moments about some, what I would call myths and misconceptions that we see around cybersecurity and around IT risk management. And I think these are all quotations that I've heard from people on both the business and the technology side in recent years. The first one we often hear from business executives is, well, I just have to leave it to my IT team to make sure we're covered. When I hear that, I know right away that this is an organization that's in the old model. They view it as an IT problem. This poor CIO or IT team, has been set up to fail because, the business is holding them accountable and yet not taking responsibility from a business perspective. We're passing all of our audits. A bunch of comments I can make on this one. First of all, I'm pretty certain that every organization that has been hacked, all those big names, they were all passing their audits too. Unfortunately, when the focus is passing audits, it's a checkbox exercise in many cases, and the bar is not set high enough to appropriately manage risk and to appropriately cover the personal risk of the directors and officers. We've got lots of security, firewalls, etc. Hear this one a lot. And again, this one's kind of related to the first one. And because really what it's saying is, hey, this is just an IT problem and we've got good security. And the organizations may have good security, but it's not really about what you're doing. It's about what the business understands and they're bought into. And firewalls alone, as we've talked about, certainly are not going to protect you in today's world where you're taking your most critical systems and opening them up to the world. And the firewalls, you've opened holes in the firewalls and let people right through. We've outsourced, so they're on the hook. This is a common misconception that if you outsource something that it's not your problem anymore, it's the outsourcer, and that's not the case. You can outsource operations, you never outsource risk. It's often said that it's, the person who really takes the biggest hit, when there's an outsourcer involved and someone gets hacked is the organization with the biggest brand. And that's certainly the case in Fazio Mechanical Services and Target. But the reality is, and from a legal perspective, is you are still responsible, and from a regulatory perspective, you're still responsible even if you've outsourced operations to someone else. In fact, you could argue that in some cases, you've actually increased your risk because you've now got a third party that you need to manage and you don't have direct control over. We use, and you can say insert whatever your ERP system is here. They might say, well, we use SAP or we use Oracle, so we don't have to worry about it. There's benefits to using those kinds of systems, but then there's also risks that come with them as well. And one client that we work with that has an SAP system and has many hundreds of interfaces that they've created into SAP over the years. And in fact, and so these are the connections we're talking about. And a lot of them are read, but they're not all just read. And they don't track them. And so what happens is they need another connection. The developers just go and create another interface. And so, there's a ton of sort of duplication and inefficiency there, but there's also a big risk exposure there also. We already know all the risks. This one, people often think, well, geez, we do a risk assessment. We already know what they are. We find that's not the case. We find that in virtually every situation where a risk assessment gets done or where people implement IT risk management, they will certainly confirm things that they knew, but they will invariably find a lot of things that they didn't know. And some of those things can be fixed very quickly. Some of them are more fundamental. But generally speaking, risk management or risks are identified based on the issue of the day. It's the fire that's burning or whatever has blown up more recently. And the essence of good risk management is taking proactive action. It's much less expensive, much less work to identify things in advance and fix them proactively. Continue on. This just sounds like good housekeeping. I've heard this. People aren't often honest enough to say this, but they'll say, "Well, geez, what do we need to worry about our crown jewels? We've got the firewalls. This is just good housekeeping." And when I hear that, that's a telltale sign of somebody who's in this old model of, we've got we've got the firewalls, we've got the walls. Who cares what we have internally? And that's absolutely not in keeping with modern risk management, where you really do need to know your crown jewels and you need to know your connections. This one's interesting. I've been here 15 years. How do I bring this forward now? And so there's this idea that if, hey, look, we've just had to live with these risks and, I own them now. They see them as my, I've been the CIO here for a long time. And if I bring it forward, it's going to be, well, why did you let it get this way? Or, why didn't you fix this earlier? I think that's actually an easy one to deal with, because the reality is that, what was an issue 5 years ago, it may not have been as critical, but the world really has changed. And so, as we said, the nature of who's coming after you has changed. You've got a lot of systems that used to be buried inside of the organization are now being open and connected. And so it's not actually that difficult to be able to come forward and say, up until now we've been able to manage with the way we have, but we're at a tipping point now where we need to manage in a new way. So that's not such a hard one to turn over. Another one, no point turning over the rocks if I can't do anything about it. I think that's the wrong way to approach it. I think that if, smart CIOs turn over the rocks, identify the issues and get them into their plan rather than just hoping that something's not going to happen on their watch. I'm too busy. That's sort of the number one in IT. Or I guess another way of saying that is my personal favorite. I'm going to get to this in 6 months. And to go along with this point, I've put a picture of what I like to think of as the land of 6 months. And as you can see here in this picture, it's a happy place. The sun is shining, and there's deer frolicking in the field, and there's butterflies, and it looks like everybody there has lots of time to do all the things they need to do. And as we know, the land of 6 months is a mythical land because it doesn't exist. 6 months from now, we will be just as busy, if not busier, than we are today. Things always seem like we'll have lots of time in the future, and when we get there, we won't. And that sort of brings me to another picture that I like, that I find helpful thinking about this. It's the old time management quadrant of sort of rating things by their importance. So what's not important, what's important, and rating that against urgency. So urgent and not urgent. And so what you end up with in these boxes on the bottom here, you end up with a couple of boxes where it's not important. So who cares? You then on the top line here end up with the things that are urgent and important. So we're working on those things right now because we have to, and they're urgent and they're important. And then we get this purple box here with things that are important but they aren't urgent. And that's where a lot of risk management and security activities occur. And in IT, it's difficult because we never really have enough money and enough people and time to do all the things we need to do. But really, in my experience in business, the essence really of good management, or one of the key things that separates good managers from weak managers, is that the good managers find a way to get these not urgent things, these not urgent but important things done ahead of time before they become urgent. And so it's not easy. It's definitely a challenge. But that's really, to me, one of the sort of critical success factors, or one of the key essences of who the truly effective executives are versus the ineffective executives who are always reacting. So if I have a few moments, there's a few sort of final topics I can cover. People often ask about that as it relates to IT risk management. So I'll spend a few moments. I've got just a few more slides here. So one thing I'll talk about is shadow IT. We hear this a lot. I think for us as IT professionals, we know all about this. There's this whole proliferation of web-based systems, of SaaS-based systems that the business units, that users are using without the knowledge of IT. A lot of things like even document converting files, where people think, well, it's not a big deal. I'm just building a PDF, or I'm just creating an image file. Not realizing that they don't know where the data is going on the internet, so they're maybe taking sensitive or crown jewel data and letting it out to a place that's going to keep a copy, or B, when that image file comes back, maybe it's got some kind of an exploit in it. So there's this proliferation of things we call shadow IT. This image here, this is, I think, when we say shadow IT to IT people, this is kind of what they feel. This is the image that gets conjured up in the mind of IT people. But when you say shadow IT to business people, this is the image that gets conjured up in their mind of, the business hero who is throwing off the shackles of unresponsive IT and getting what they need and delivering for their business. So there's a disconnect here. The issue, of course, from a risk perspective, is that these shadow IT systems, or shadow systems, often end up interacting with our crown jewel data. So the users might say, well, it's not a big deal. We're just using Workday. We're just doing a few HR processes over here because our HR system doesn't support it. But then you look at it and you realize they've got regulated HR data in there. Or they've taken one of these systems and they've actually created interfaces into other systems in our organization that have crown jewel data. And they just don't often realize that from a business perspective. The other point, though, that I often make is that the term shadow IT is almost a misnomer nowadays, because for many organizations, it's just the way that the organization is built. It's a fact of life for them. They, in many cases, the business units have a fair degree of autonomy of the technology that they use, and the IT organization doesn't have central command and control over the tools that are used. So as an IT organization, we're sort of forced, or there's an opportunity rather for us to be in a more consultative role, where we're working with the various business units, helping them to understand the impact of some of these things they're using from an IT perspective. Because what we often find is that the users will make the right decision from a risk perspective if they're given the facts and if they understand the impact of some of the things that they're doing. And this is where I was saying that what often works is a consultative and educative approach, that rather than penalizing people sort of seeks to understand why they're using what they're using, helping them to see what the risks are, helping them to use them in a safe way. And the other thing we have to accept as an IT organization is that if our users are using these tools, it's telling us that they have a need. I mean, there's something that they felt that they couldn't get from IT, and there was a reason why they felt they had to go to one of these other tools. It could just be a lack of knowledge of what we offer them from an IT perspective, or it could speak to some real needs that maybe we can help them to try to solve from an IT perspective. And so again, what we see a lot of our clients doing is not being punitive. They're basically saying, okay, look, you're using Workday, let's get it on the map, let's risk score it, let's make it part of the program, and then helping to educate the business, in terms of what that means to their overall risk picture, and then maybe going out and working with that vendor that provides the third party system to take them through our risk survey process. And the other point that we often make with our clients is to not forget about Excel and macros. I guess this is probably the original shadow IT. In many organizations, when we go in and start working with them and they start identifying their crown jewels and their critical applications to do risk assessment on, they'll tend to focus on some of these kinds of logos down on the bottom of the page, and they'll forget about the macros. And the way we say to handle that is to just treat macros and spreadsheets like they're an app. So if it's got important data in it, if it's critical to the business, if the business depends on that macro or that spreadsheet being used, then treat it like it's an application. In our world, Excel is the platform, and whatever the report is or the macro is, that's what the application is, and get it on the map and risk score it. Talk for a moment about cloud as well. I think I've covered a lot of components of cloud from a risk perspective in shadow IT that we've just talked about. But there's a couple of other perspectives to share. One of the things that we often find is that if managed properly, moving certain things to the cloud can often be an improvement in security. So in a lot of cases, you'll see something that is currently a manual process. You've got important data in Excel files being sent around by email, and taking that and moving that into a cloud-based application that's got a good, control security model, that's got, user-based or role-based access, that has got the proper encryption in place, is actually a net improvement in security. And in many cases, especially for smaller organizations, it may not be cost-effective for them to try to have the same level of security in their own organization that somebody like a Microsoft or some other third-party cloud provider, that they can afford to provide for them. And this is another area, moving things to the cloud, assessing the risk of moving things to the cloud is a key area where you can see benefits from having a risk management program in place. Putting an IT risk management program in place gives you a way to more objectively, measure, quantify, and present to the business executives what the risk of moving to the cloud is, and it will actually help to support that decision if that's where you want to go as an IT organization. The other point I'll make around cloud as it pertains to risk is if you are moving things into the cloud and you are now starting to rely more on SaaS applications, what that really means from a risk perspective is you've got to get good or make sure that you're good at third-party risk management, vendor risk management. We see a lot of organizations that are embracing cloud. They're making the case that it's an improvement in security, and they're probably right, but then they have no formal process in place to assess the security of the vendors. And that's an area where you can close gaps, relatively quickly, by first of all, sort of, working with the third party to, include them on your map, do your risk assessment, putting together a risk checklist that you drive them through, and maybe working with your legal team to put together a security and privacy addendum, for example, that maybe becomes a standard part of all of your contracts with third-party vendors. So you're now, having your vendors sign off that they're going to meet a certain minimum level of security, and maybe even assigning some of the risk onto them and onto their insurance. And as I mentioned, this is, the third-party risk management is definitely an area where you can often drive some real quick wins and improve your net risk posture as an organization without a lot of time or a lot of expense. I'll talk for a moment about Internet of Things. It's something that is getting a lot of buzz in the media today. I don't think it's getting enough buzz from a security perspective. It's exciting, but also I think concerning, scary from a privacy and security perspective. There's this huge rush of innovation around Internet of Things. There's just so many exciting things that are being done, and I talk about the sort of risks of Internet of Things, and yet I'm guilty of this. So this is a picture of my watch. It's the Fitbit watch that integrates with my smartphone and puts my data in the cloud. And I got so excited about how cool this thing is that I bought them for my kids. My wife's got one, and now all our personal biometric data is being uploaded into the cloud, where probably somebody could hack it if they want to. And that's just a little personal example, but it's happening all through businesses, where business units are seeing all kinds of creative opportunities to connect, non-traditional technology to their systems, and are now creating these new vectors through which they can be attacked and their data can be compromised. In many ways, it reminds me of the early days of application security, where the business units saw so much potential value in webifying applications or connecting their business applications to their partners through interfaces, that it was springing up all through organizations way faster than any central security group could get their arms around it. And what was happening was that the software developers really weren't thinking about security. They were thinking about functionality. They were thinking maybe about scalability. And that's the exact same thing is happening with the Internet of Things manufacturers. There are no common standards around security. You're seeing a lot of really basic gaps, things like, if a device fails, does it fail closed or fail opened? Just very fundamental things that have been part of the security world now for a couple of decades. You're seeing Internet of Things devices that have data connect to our systems and fail open. And so, unfortunately, I think there's going to have to be a lot more pain around Internet of Things, and there's going to be more and more high-profile hacking stories before people really get mobilized around having some better standards. Just kind of like what happened with application security. And in terms of examples, you're seeing probably one of the earlier Internet of Things examples was what happened in Iran with the centrifuges, where you have these offline devices controlled by SCADA systems, SCADA controllers that were compromised by an online hack, and caused devastating damage. I guess fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective. There have been a number of examples where water purification companies have been affected. There was one in Australia going back to the year 2000 that got a lot of press when a teenager was able to change chemical compositions in a water treatment plant. That's continued to happen. It happened a few years ago in Springfield, and it happened recently, just this past year. It's a fictitious company called Kumiri Water Company. Verizon did a large security report. They've changed the name of the company for confidentiality reasons, but it was a very large water treatment company in the U.S. that was compromised by hackers, and they were able to change chemical compositions. And so, seeing some potentially really big impacts from connecting things to the internet. I think everybody's familiar now with how you can be spied on through your webcam. James Comey, the director of the FBI, just about a month and a half ago, was at a conference and was basically saying that, you're crazy if you don't have a piece of tape over your webcam. So you've got the director of the FBI saying that he puts a piece of tape over his webcam, and I certainly do as well. Cell phones are kind of an early, Bashir's just pointing out that he doesn't have tape on his webcam, but maybe the next time he will. Oh, he does. I apologize. He's got a cover on his. Actually, he's got quite a nice little cover here on his. So cell phones, I guess, can be thought of as the Internet of Things. People are, connecting cell phones to corporate networks through BYOD, bring your own device, and people are now rapidly learning about all the security problems that are coming along with that. But you're also seeing a whole host of devices now that are being connected to mobile apps. So here's an example of a Bluetooth lock that was hacked not too long ago. So people, could effectively come up to your house and very quickly disable your lock and walk in. You may say, well, that's not such a big deal because the chances of that happening are pretty slim. But what if that was happening in a hotel room? And in fact, that has happened. There have been cases recently where people have been able to hack the card readers. And so now you've got definitely a personal safety concern. You've also, got a corporate espionage concern where, people are going to hotels that have conferences and going through people's hotel rooms. I've got a picture up here of this is a schematic of the denial of service attack that occurred just before the U.S. election. If everybody remembers that, the internet was effectively down for the day in the U.S. What's fascinating about this to me is, that we've done a good job of combating denial of service attacks. At one point in time, we were thinking that was a solved problem. Well, this was a denial of service attack that was caused by digital video recorders and by closed circuit TV cameras. So hackers took control of internet connected DVRs and CCTVs and then used those devices. Again, these are devices without some of the basic security controls that we've learned to put into other internet connected applications, and they were able to flood the internet with traffic from those devices and cause a denial of service. If you haven't seen the Jeep hacking videos, then you should probably go online and check those out. But they've been able to demonstrate remotely taking control of a Jeep, turning the air conditioning on, even controlling the steering wheel and driving it into the ditch. And no doubt if they wanted to, they could probably also turn off the airbags before they did that as well. Got a lot of people maybe thinking twice about technology in cars, and yet at the same time here we are driving forward with self-driving cars. So imagine the ability to take those things over and cause massive traffic jams and car crashes. There's a story not too long ago about Hello Barbie. Hello Barbie is a Barbie that can be connected through Wi-Fi, and so Barbie can interact with your child and listen to what they're saying and can respond back. Well, Hello Barbie's been hacked, so some creep stranger on the internet can interact with your daughter through her Hello Barbie. And last but certainly not least is the whole sort of wealth of implantable devices that are now being connected through Wi-Fi. And so, there's some great benefits in connecting defibrillators and pacemakers to external technology, insulin pumps, foot drop reflexes, some of the neurostimulators, the cochlear implants for ears. But now, of course, imagine, the devastating impacts of having those things hacked. And there have been, cases, not all of them true, but there have been a number of reported cases where these devices are indeed either have been hacked or are susceptible to being hacked. So, again, there's so many exciting things happening around Internet of Things. My advice from a security and risk perspective is to approach them with caution. Do not assume, I guess, that security has been built into any of these devices. In fact, I would assume the opposite. Assume that it's like the early days of application security. You've got to go back and ask some really basic questions about these devices, and almost assume that these devices will be hacked. So if you're going to use these personally or connect them to your corporate data and your corporate networks, do it in a cautious way. Basically do it in areas where you can afford to be hacked. And the other piece of it is a lot of this technology is often not patchable. Just to sort of go back to some of the fundamental, issues. Some of these things, have hard-coded BIOSes and cannot easily be updated. So you've got something that's possibly even implanted in someone. A security flaw becomes well known, and there's actually nothing you can do about it short of having surgery. So, in terms, if we sort of take this back, and I think, Bashir, this may be my last slide or getting pretty close to it, is kind of where to start. This is often what people will ask. They'll say, we want to get going with IT risk management, but we don't know where to start. Often when it comes to security, some of the low-hanging fruit that people often talk about is end-user education, putting policies and procedures in place. I do totally agree with that. These are, if you've got only a few places to start, these are definitely good places to start. You get a lot of bang for your buck. The problem is they're not very exciting and they're hard to keep momentum around. And what we find is that Agile risk management becomes a very good way to close this loop. So really, Agile risk management is about taking some small steps to get the business engaged, helping the business to understand, communicating security in a language that they can understand, using some pictures and dashboards so that they're now part of the process. And now you've got a context. So you've got a line of business executive maybe who understands what the risk is, and now you've got their support to drive things like end user education, to drive policies and procedures that are appropriate to the company, and maybe not overkill but appropriate to the company. So this becomes a nice loop that helps to support. And so I would say these are kind of the three areas if you're looking for low-hanging fruit. The key, of course, as I mentioned, is getting executive buy-in. Not carrying the rock on your back. And again, it's counterintuitive, but it's not necessarily buying more technology. And we have this bias to want to buy the latest protective technology. And in a lot of cases, what we're doing is thickening walls in certain areas when people are walking around the corners or going over top or underneath. And so again, what Agile IT risk management is going to help you do is it's going to help you find where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. So that's so I'll leave it at that, Bashir, and I guess we can turn over perhaps to some questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, for a very informative webinar that we at CIPS are honored to continue to put on. As you're aware, we do it twice a month to enable our members to hear different viewpoints and also to remain current on challenges in the IT field. That's all part of our continuing education that we do. I want to also thank all the attendees tonight and those of you who are watching this video now, because we are recording and making it available for you. Please visit our website at www.kips.ca that I identified right up front, because there are many other recordings of webinars that we've done with international people on different subjects of machine learning, artificial intelligence, cloud, quantum computing, risk management, security, and audit compliance, so that you can take advantage of that. Once again, thank you for taking time to both listen to this, whether you're watching it live or otherwise, and stay connected to CIPS. We have also a group on LinkedIn and Facebook and our own website, so that we can continue to help and be partners with you. So thank you very much, and good night.